He had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking London's Thames, a fleet of luxury cars, and women from Britain's most prestigious families competing for his attention. Marcus Whitfield was untouchable, or so he thought. But when a simple act of cruelty toward a struggling African medical student came back to haunt him 15 years later, he would discover that sometimes the person you least expect holds your very life in their hands. What happened in that hospital room will make you question everything you think you know about second chances, and the twist that follows will leave you speechless. This isn't just a story about karma, it's about the incredible journey of a woman who rose from nothing to become the one person who could save the man who once destroyed her dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive Mayfair restaurant as Marcus Whitfield adjusted his platinum cufflinks, barely glancing at the woman sitting across from him. Lady Catherine Pemberton, daughter of a prominent banker, had been speaking about her recent charity auction for the past 20 minutes. But Marcus found himself more interested in the reflection of his Patek Philippe watch in the wine-glass dotted 28. Marcus was everything London's elite society expected from an heir to the Whitfield pharmaceutical empire. Tall, with sharp features and the kind of confidence that came from never having to want for anything, he moved through life as if the world existed purely for his convenience. The Whitfield name opened doors, commanded respect, and attracted women who saw him as their ticket to a life of luxury. The auction raised over £200,000, Catherine continued, her voice carrying that distinctive upper-class accent that Marcus had grown accustomed to. Daddy says it's the most successful event the foundation has ever hosted. Marcus nodded politely, but his attention had already drifted to his phone, where notifications from his investment portfolio painted a picture of another profitable day. The pharmaceutical company his grandfather had built from nothing was now worth over £5 billion, and as the sole heir, Marcus lived in the comfortable certainty that his future was already written in gold. "That's impressive," he replied automatically, not looking up from his screen. "Your father must be pleased." Catherine smiled, interpreting his distraction as the busy schedule of a successful businessman, rather than the boredom it actually was. She leaned forward slightly, her diamond necklace catching the candlelight. "Perhaps you could join us for the next event? Having the Whitfield name associated with our charity would be wonderful for publicity." There it was, the inevitable request. Marcus had learned to recognize the pattern. First came the dinner invitations, then the charity events, followed by introductions to family members, and finally, the subtle hints about marriage and merging family fortunes. It was a dance he had performed dozens of times with dozens of different women, each one believing she would be the one to finally capture his heart. The truth was, Marcus wasn't sure he had a heart to capture. He had grown up in a world where love was a transaction, where marriages were business mergers disguised as romance, and where genuine emotion was a weakness to be exploited. His own parents had maintained a cold, distant relationship built on social expectations rather than affection, and he had learned early that people wanted him for what he represented, not who he was. "I'll have my assistant check my calendar," he said, the practiced response rolling off his tongue without thought. As Catherine launched into another story about her social circle, Marcus found himself wondering if this was how he would spend the rest of his life: elegant dinners with interchangeable women, discussing charity events and social obligations, while his grandfather's empire grew larger and more impersonal with each passing year. The thought didn't particularly disturb him. It was simply the natural order of things that his phone buzzed with a message from his driver, informing him that the car was waiting outside. Marcus glanced at his watch, 9:47 p.m. He had another engagement across town, a business dinner with potential Investors from Dubai who were interested in expanding Whitfield Pharmaceuticals into the Middle Eastern market. "I'm afraid I'll have to cut this evening short," he said, already signaling for the waiter. "Business calls." Catherine's face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly with the grace of someone trained from birth to hide disappointment. "Of course. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over the weekend. I'm hosting a small gathering at the country estate." Marcus smiled the practiced smile that had charmed his way through countless social situations. "That sounds lovely. I'll be in touch." He settled the bill with his black card, left a generous tip that would ensure the staff remembered him favorably, and helped Catherine with her coat. Outside, his driver waited beside a gleaming Bentley, its dark paint reflecting the streetlights. Like liquid obsidian dot, the drive across London gave Marcus time to review his notes for the upcoming meeting. The Dubai investors represented a significant opportunity to expand the company's reach, but more importantly, they offered something that intrigued him, a challenge. Unlike the predictable world of London society, international business required strategy, risk assessment, and the kind of intellectual engagement that had been missing from his recent dealings. As the Bentley glided through the nearly empty streets, Marcus reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. After graduating from Oxford with a degree in business, he had spent 2 years learning every aspect of the pharmaceutical industry from the ground up. His grandfather, William Whitfield, had insisted that the heir to the empire understand not just the financial side of the business, but the science, the regulatory challenges, and the human impact of their work. "Money without purpose is just paper," the old man had told him during one of their weekly lunches. "Our family built this company on the belief that we could make life better for people. Never forget that responsibility." It was a noble sentiment, and one that Marcus genuinely respected, even if he sometimes struggled to connect it to the abstract world of profit margins and market share that dominated his daily existence. The Whitfield Foundation donated millions to medical research each year, and their drugs had helped treat everything from diabetes to heart disease. But Marcus found it difficult to see beyond the numbers on the balance sheet to the actual human lives those numbers represented. The car pulled up outside the Shard, London's gleaming pyramid of glass and steel that pierced the night sky like a modern-day Tower of Babel. The restaurant on the 42nd floor offered panoramic views of the city. But more importantly, it provided the kind of exclusive atmosphere that made powerful people feel comfortable discussing sensitive business matters. Marcus straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors. As he ascended toward the meeting that would, unknown to him, set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. He had no way of knowing that 20 floors below, in the hospital attached to the building's lower levels, a young woman was fighting her own battle, one that would eventually intersect with his in ways he could never imagine. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 42nd floor, and Marcus stepped out into the sophisticated world he had always known, unaware that far below, in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital corridors, his future was about to be shaped by choices he hadn't yet made and consequences he couldn't yet foresee. As he walked toward the private dining room where his business associates waited, Marcus Whitfield was still the golden boy of London society, the heir to a pharmaceutical empire, and a man who believed that his position in life was as unshakable as the glass towers that surrounded him. He had no idea that within a matter of hours, he would make a decision that would haunt him for 15 years and ultimately place his life in the hands of the one person he least expected to see again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The business dinner had gone better than expected. The Dubai investors were not only interested in expanding Whitfield Pharmaceuticals into the Middle East, but they were also discussing potential partnerships that could triple the company's revenue within 5 years. Marcus felt the familiar rush of a successful negotiation as he left the restaurant, his mind already calculating the implications for his personal fortune. It was nearly midnight when his driver dropped him off at his Kensington penthouse, but Marcus was too energized to sleep. The adrenaline from the business meeting, combined with the wine, had left him restless. He decided to take a walk, something he rarely did in London's night air, but the success of the evening made him feel invincible. The streets of Kensington were quiet at this hour, lined with elegant townhouses and the occasional late-night taxi. Marcus had walked only a few blocks when he heard it, a commotion coming from the direction of St. Mary's Hospital. Curious, and still riding the high of his successful evening, he decided to investigate. As he approached the hospital's emergency entrance, he saw a crowd of people gathered around the automatic doors. Most were clearly patients or family members, tired, worried faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting spilling out from the building. But what caught his attention was the heated discussion taking place near the entrance. A security guard was blocking the path of a young black woman who appeared to be in her early 20s. She was holding a stack of papers and what looked like a medical textbook, her voice raised in frustration as she tried to reason with the guard. "Please, I just need to speak with Dr. Richardson for 5 minutes," she was saying, her accent carrying the musical tones of West Africa. "He's expecting me. I'm supposed to start my clinical rotation tomorrow morning." The security guard, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, shook his head firmly. "Look, miss, I don't care what you think you're supposed to do. It's past visiting hours, and I don't have any record of you being authorized to be here. You need to leave and come back during regular hours." "But I've been trying to reach him all week," the woman insisted, her voice cracking slightly with desperation. "There was a problem with my paperwork, and if I don't get this sorted out tonight, I'll lose my placement. Please, I've come so far to get here." Marcus found himself drawing closer, intrigued despite himself. The woman was clearly distressed, but there was something about her determination, the way she refused to give up even in the face of the guard's obstinate refusal, that captured his attention. She was beautiful, but not in the polished artificial way of the women he usually encountered. Her beauty was natural, unadorned, high cheekbones, expressive dark eyes, and skin that seemed to glow even under the harsh hospital lighting. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore plain jeans and a worn leather jacket that had seen better days. Everything about her spoke of someone who had traveled far and struggled hard to get where she was. "Listen, I'm going to have to call the police if you don't leave voluntarily," the guard was saying, his hand moving toward the radio clip to his belt. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, and Marcus could see the defeat beginning to creep into her posture. It was then that she noticed him watching, and their eyes met across the small crowd. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of pride, desperation, and an intelligence that seemed to look right through him. Marcus felt an unfamiliar impulse. Here was someone who clearly needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. A word from him, a phone call, perhaps a small donation to the hospital. Any of these things could probably resolve her situation in minutes. It would cost him nothing, and it might make a genuine difference in someone's life. But as he took a step forward, ready to intervene, something stopped him cold. One of the other people in the crowd, a well-dressed man who appeared to be waiting for news about a patient, had recognized him. "Marcus Whitfield," the man said loudly, extending his hand. "James Peterson, we met at the Carlton Club last month. What brings you to this part of town so late?" The mention of his name rippled through the small crowd. Several people turned to look at him with sudden interest, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of being recognized, of being on display. The Whitfield name carried significant influence in London's medical community. His family's pharmaceutical company funded research at several major hospitals, including St. Mary's. "Just passing by," Marcus replied carefully. shaking Peterson's hand while acutely aware that the young woman was still watching him. Peterson lowered his voice conspiratorially. Terrible business. These people trying to get into the hospital. At all hours. The security should be tighter if you ask me. You never know what kind of trouble they might cause. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Peterson was clearly referring to the African woman, and the casual racism in his tone was unmistakable. Marcus felt his chest tighten with anger, but not at Peterson, at himself, for caring about the opinion of someone whose views he found repugnant. But then another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to a woman Marcus recognized as Margaret Ashford, wife of a prominent Conservative MP and major donor to various social causes. "Oh, Marcus, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of moving in influential circles. "I was just telling James that we really must do something about these situations. It's becoming quite the problem, you know. People showing up at hospitals, claiming to be medical students or researchers, trying to gain access to sensitive areas." She gestured dismissively toward the young woman, who was now being firmly escorted away from the entrance by the security guard. "I'm sure she has some sob story about lost paperwork or missed appointments, but really, if she belonged here, she would have proper authorization, wouldn't she?" Marcus felt the moment crystallizing around him. Here was his chance to speak up, to use his influence to help someone who clearly needed it. But he was also acutely aware of the eyes watching him, of the social dynamics at play, of the expectations that came with his position in this particular world. The young woman had stopped, struggling against the security guard's gentle but firm guidance, and was now looking directly at Marcus. There was no pleading in her expression, no attempt to appeal to his sympathy. Instead, there was something that looked like recognition, not of who he was, but of what he was about to do. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," Marcus heard himself saying, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "Security should definitely be tighter. We can't have just anyone wandering around claiming to belong here." The words felt like ash in his mouth even as he spoke them, but the approval in Margaret's smile and the nods from the other well-dressed bystanders told him he had said exactly what was expected of him. The young woman's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. The look she gave him wasn't one of anger or disappointment. It was worse than that. It was understanding. She had taken his measure in that moment and found him exactly as small as he feared he was. "Quite right," Peterson agreed, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Good to see you taking a sensible position on these matters. Your grandfather would be proud. He never tolerated nonsense from people trying to take advantage of the system." As the security guard finally succeeded in moving the woman away from the entrance, Marcus caught one last glimpse of her face. She wasn't looking at him with hatred or even hurt. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pity, as if she felt sorry for him, for the choice he had just made, for the man he had just revealed himself to be. The crowd began to disperse, and Marcus found himself walking back toward his penthouse in a daze. The excitement from his successful business meeting had evaporated entirely, replaced by a hollow feeling he couldn't quite identify. He tried to tell himself that he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply remained neutral in a situation. That wasn't his concern, but even as he rode the elevator up to his luxurious apartment, even as he poured himself a drink and stood looking out at the glittering lights of London spread below him, Marcus couldn't shake the image of those dark eyes, looking at him with such devastating clarity. He had no way of knowing that the woman's name was Dr. Adaora Okafor, that she was a brilliant medical student from Nigeria who had worked 3 jobs to pay for her education, or that she had been 1 semester away from completing her degree at one of London's most prestigious medical schools, before a bureaucratic error had threatened to derail everything she had worked for. He didn't know that she had been living on less than £10 a day for the past month, saving every penny to pay for the paperwork that would allow her to continue her studies. He didn't know that the clinical rotation she was trying to secure at St. Mary's was her last chance to complete her degree before her student visa expired. Most importantly, he had no way of knowing that 15 years later, when his own life hung in the balance, Dr. Adaura Okafor would be the one person with the skill and knowledge to save him. And in that moment of ultimate vulnerability, she would remember exactly who Marcus Whitfield was, and exactly what kind of man he had chosen to be on a cold London night when she needed help the most. As Marcus finally fell asleep in his king-sized bed, surrounded by luxury and comfort, Adaura sat in a cramped bedsit across town, staring at the letter that had arrived that afternoon, informing her that her academic probation had been extended indefinitely. Her dreams of becoming a doctor, of returning to Nigeria to help her community, of proving that a girl from a small village could make it in the world's most prestigious medical institutions, all of it seemed to be slipping away. But Adaura Okafor was not the kind of person who gave up easily. And as she sat in that small room, planning her next move, she had no idea that the path ahead of her would lead not just to the fulfillment of her dreams, but to a moment of profound reckoning with the man who had watched her struggle and chosen to look away. 3 months had passed since that night at St. Mary's Hospital, and Adaura Okafor's life had become a delicate balancing act between desperation and determination. The cramped bedsit in East London that she called home was barely larger than a closet, with a single window that looked out onto a brick wall and a heating system that worked only when it felt like it. But it was all she could afford on her dwindling savings, and more importantly, it was hers. The letter from Imperial College London lay on her tiny desk, its official letterhead now familiar after weeks of similar correspondence. Academic probation extended pending resolution of clinical placement requirements. The words had lost their sting through repetition, but their meaning remained as devastating as ever. Without completing her clinical rotations, she couldn't graduate. Without graduating, her student visa would expire. Without her visa, she would be forced to return to Nigeria with nothing to show for the 4 years of sacrifice that had brought her this far. Adaura folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the growing pile of documents that chronicled her bureaucratic nightmare. A mix-up in the hospital's student placement system had somehow erased her from their records, and despite weeks of phone calls, emails, and in-person visits, no one seemed able or willing to fix the error. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist in the system. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to London with stellar grades from the University of Lagos, a partial scholarship that covered her tuition, and dreams of returning to Nigeria as a qualified doctor who could make a real difference in her community. Her village of Enugu had only one clinic, staffed by a single overworked nurse, and the nearest hospital was a 3-hour journey over roads that became impassable during the rainy season. Adaura had grown up watching people die from treatable conditions, simply because there was no one qualified to help them. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. The screen showed a familiar number, her mother calling from Nigeria. Adaura hesitated before answering. These weekly calls had become increasingly difficult as her situation grew more desperate, but she couldn't bring herself to cut off one of the few connections to home she had left. Adaura, my daughter, her mother's voice crackled through the poor connection, warm despite the distance. How are your studies going? They're going well, Mama, Adaura replied, the lie sliding off her tongue with practiced ease. I'm working very hard. Good, good. Your father is so proud when he tells people in the village that his daughter is becoming a doctor in London. Mrs. Aku's son is studying accounting in Dubai, but she always says it's not the same as medicine. The pride in her mother's voice was like a knife twisting in Adaura's chest. Her parents had sold their only cow to help pay for her plane ticket to London. Her father had taken on extra work as a security guard, despite his arthritis, to send her £20 every month, money she knew they could barely afford. The entire village had contributed to a collection that helped fund her first year's expenses, believing they were investing in someone who would return as a qualified doctor. "Mama, how is Papa's health?" Adaura asked, desperate to change the subject. "Oh, you know how he is. Still refuses to go to the clinic for his cough. Says it's just the dust from the construction site where he works. But I worry about him, Adaura. He sounds worse at night." Adaura closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on her shoulders. Her father's chronic cough had started months ago, but like most people in their village, he distrusted the medical system and couldn't afford proper treatment, even if he wanted it. Having a daughter who was a doctor would mean everything to him, not just for the prestige, but for the practical knowledge and connections she could provide. "Tell him to please see someone about the cough," Adaura said. "Promise me you'll make him go to the clinic." "I will try, but you know how stubborn he is. He says he'll wait until you come home with your degree, then you can be his doctor." After the call ended, Adaura sat in the gathering darkness of her small room, unable to afford to turn on the electric heater. The responsibility she carried felt crushing, not just to herself and her own dreams, but to her family, her village, and all the people who believed in her. Failure wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of everyone who had sacrificed to give her this opportunity. She pulled her laptop from under the bed, a second-hand machine she had bought with her last birthday money from home, and opened her email for the 15th time that day. Still nothing from the hospital administration. Still no response from Dr. Richardson, the clinical supervisor who had supposedly been expecting her that night 3 months ago. Still no solution to the bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to keep people like her on the outside. But Adaura had not survived growing up in rural Nigeria, excelling in a university system that favored the wealthy and connected, and making it to London on sheer determination only to give up now. She opened a new document and began typing yet another letter, this one to the Dean of Students at Imperial College. "Dear Dean Morrison," she began, "I am writing to request your personal intervention in resolving a critical issue with my clinical placement that threatens to derail not only my education, but my ability to return to Nigeria as a qualified physician. As," she wrote, Adaura thought about the night at St. Mary's Hospital and the man who had watched her struggle with such cold indifference. She had learned his name from overheard conversations, Marcus Whitfield, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. Someone whose single word could have opened the doors that remained stubbornly closed to her. The memory of his casual dismissal still stung, not because she had expected help from a stranger, but because of what it revealed about a system that valued connections over merit, wealth over worth. The next morning brought another rejection, this time from King's College Hospital, where she had applied for an alternative clinical placement. The letter was polite but firm. All positions for the current academic year had been filled months ago, and they encouraged her to reapply for the following year. But Adaura didn't have a following year. Her visa would expire before then. And she couldn't afford to extend her stay, even if she were allowed to. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Adaura spent her last £10 on a train ticket to Cambridge, where a former professor from Lagos now worked as a research coordinator. Dr. Emeka Nwosu had been her mentor during her undergraduate years, and he was one of the few people in the UK who truly understood both her potential and her predicament. The journey to Cambridge gave her time to think. As the English countryside rolled past the train windows, Adaura reflected on the path that had brought her here. She had been born in a small village where electricity was sporadic and running water was a luxury. Her parents, despite having only primary school educations themselves, had recognized her intelligence early and made enormous sacrifices to send her to school in the nearest town. She had excelled academically, not because learning came easily to her, but because she understood that education was her only ticket out of poverty. While other children played, she studied by candlelight. While her peers dreamed of marriage and family, She dreamed of medical school. When she scored the highest marks in her region on the university entrance exams, the entire village had celebrated. As if one of their own had won the lottery, the University of Lagos had been a culture shock. Suddenly she was surrounded by wealthy students whose parents were doctors, lawyers, and government officials. They spoke English with perfect accents, wore designer clothes, and took for granted the kind of educational opportunities Addaura had fought tooth and nail to access. But she had thrived there too, graduating at the top of her class and earning the scholarship that made her London dreams possible. Dr. Nwosu's office at Cambridge was everything she remembered about academia at its best. Walls lined with books, papers scattered across every surface, and the kind of intellectual energy that made complex problems seem solvable. He was a small man with graying hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but his reputation in the field of tropical medicine was formidable. "Addaura!" he exclaimed when she knocked on his door, rising from his desk to embrace her warmly. "What a wonderful surprise! But you look thin, my dear. Are you eating enough?" The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve to maintain the facade that everything was fine. Instead, she found herself telling him everything: the bureaucratic nightmare, the failed attempts to secure a clinical placement, the growing desperation as her deadline approached. Dr. Nwosu listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers thoughtfully. "This is more common than you might think," he said finally. "The system here is not designed for students like you, brilliant, determined, but without the family connections that smooth over these kinds of problems. But I may have a solution." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "There's a small community clinic in Birmingham that's been struggling to find qualified help. The pay is minimal, and the conditions are challenging, but it's legitimate clinical experience. More importantly, the director is an old friend of mine who values competence over connections." Addaura felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "Do you think he would consider taking me on?" "Let me make a call," Dr. Nwosu said, already dialing. "Dr. James Okonkwo, yes, another Nigerian who made good in the UK. He runs a clinic in one of Birmingham's most underserved neighborhoods. It's not prestigious work, but it's real medicine, helping real people who need it most." As she listened to Dr. Nwosu negotiate on her behalf, Addaura felt something she had almost forgotten: the possibility that her dreams might still be within reach. The conversation was brief but animated, conducted in a mixture of English and Igbo that made her homesick and hopeful at the same time. "Good news," Dr. Nwosu announced after hanging up. "Dr. Okonkwo can offer you a position starting next month. It's not exactly what you had planned, but it will get you the clinical experience you need to graduate. And who knows? You might find that working with underserved communities is exactly where you're meant to be." Addaura felt tears of relief streaming down her face. After months of closed doors and bureaucratic indifference, someone had finally opened a window. It wasn't the prestigious hospital placement she had originally sought, but it was a chance, and in her current situation, a chance was all she needed. As she rode the train back to London that evening, Addaura thought about the long road ahead. Birmingham was a new city, with new challenges and new opportunities. The clinic work would be demanding, and the pay would barely cover her basic expenses, but it was a path forward. More importantly, it was a chance to remember why she had wanted to become a doctor in the first place, not for prestige or wealth, but to heal people who needed healing. She had no way of knowing that this detour would prove to be the foundation of an extraordinary career, one that would eventually lead her back to London as one of the most skilled emergency physicians in the country. And she certainly couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, the man who had dismissed her so casually at St. Mary's Hospital would find himself lying on a gurney, his life hanging in the balance, with Dr. Addaura Okafor as his only hope for survival. The sleek boardroom on the 45th floor of the Whitfield Pharmaceuticals Tower buzzed with tension, as thick as the London fog pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus Whitfield, now 43 and bearing the weight of 15 years as CEO, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his jaw clenched as he listened to the quarterly reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Revenue is down 18% from last quarter, announced Sarah Chun, the chief financial officer, her voice steady despite the gravity of the numbers. The patent cliff we've been anticipating for cardioxin is hitting harder than projected, and our pipeline for new drugs has been delayed by regulatory setbacks. Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure that had become his constant companion over the past 2 years. The pharmaceutical industry had changed dramatically since he'd taken over from his grandfather, and the comfortable predictability of his early years as CEO had given way to a landscape of fierce competition, regulatory challenges, and public scrutiny that would have been unimaginable decades earlier. "What about the merger discussions with Brennan Industries?" he asked, referring to the American pharmaceutical giant that had been circling Whitfield like a shark sensing wounded prey. "They've lowered their offer again," replied David Moss, the head of corporate development. "They know we're vulnerable, and they're betting that we'll have to accept whatever they're willing to pay." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. The company his grandfather had built from nothing, the empire that had defined the Whitfield name for 3 generations, was slowly slipping away despite his best efforts to save it. The stress had already cost him his marriage. Catherine had finally left him 2 years earlier, taking half his personal assets and citing his obsession with work as irreconcilable differences. The irony wasn't lost on him that his personal life had followed the same trajectory as his business dealings. He had married Catherine Pemberton 5 years after that night at St. Mary's Hospital, a union that looked perfect on paper, but had been hollow from the beginning. They had moved through the motions of upper-class married life, charity galas, country house weekends, discussions about children that never materialized, but there had been no real connection, no genuine love. "Sir," Sarah's voice cut through his reverie, "should we schedule another meeting with Brennan's representatives?" Marcus looked around the table at the faces of his senior staff, intelligent, capable people who had devoted their careers to Whitfield Pharmaceuticals and now faced the possibility of seeing everything they had built dismantled by corporate raiders. These weren't just employees. They were colleagues who had become something approaching friends, the closest thing to a real family he had in his increasingly isolated life. "Give me 48 hours, he said finally. "I want to explore one more option before we start negotiating with vultures." The meeting broke up with the kind of subdued energy that had become typical of corporate gatherings these days. Marcus remained in his chair as the others filed out, staring through the windows at the London skyline that had been the backdrop to his entire adult life. Somewhere out there, in the maze of streets and buildings, ordinary people were living their lives, dealing with problems that had nothing to do with stock prices or quarterly earnings. He thought, not for the first time, about the path that had brought him to this moment. The success of his early years as CEO now seemed like a distant memory, built on market conditions and inherited advantages that had masked his own limitations as a leader. When the challenges had mounted, new competitors, changing regulations, public criticism of pharmaceutical pricing, he had discovered that his privileged background had left him uniquely unprepared for genuine adversity. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his personal trainer, reminding him about their session that evening. At 43, he was in the best physical shape of his life, a testament to the hours he spent in his private gym trying to outrun the stress that threatened to consume him. Exercise had become his primary coping mechanism, the only time when his mind quieted enough to allow something approaching peace. 3 hours later, Marcus was pushing himself through a punishing workout routine when he felt the first sharp pain in his chest. He paused, thinking it was just muscle strain from the aggressive weight training. But the pain intensified, radiating down his left arm in a way that made his blood run cold. The heart attack hit him like a freight train. One moment he was reaching for his water bottle, and the next he was on the floor of his home gym, gasping for air as waves of agony crashed over him. His vision blurred, and he could feel his heart hammering erratically against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. With tremendous effort, he managed to call for his building's concierge service before consciousness began to slip away. The last thing he remembered was the sound of sirens growing louder, and then everything went black. Meanwhile, across London at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Dr. Addaura Okafor was midway through what had already been a 16-hour shift in the emergency department. At 37, she had become one of the most respected emergency physicians in London, known for her ability to remain calm under pressure and her uncanny skill at diagnosing complex cases that left other doctors baffled. The years since her struggles as a medical student had transformed her in ways that went far beyond professional success. The young woman who had once stood outside St. Mary's Hospital, desperate for a chance to prove herself, had evolved into a confident physician whose reputation extended throughout the London medical community. But the journey had been far from easy. The clinic in Birmingham had indeed been the lifeline Dr. Nwosu had promised, but it had also been a brutal education in the realities of medicine. Working with underserved communities had taught her to be resourceful, to make difficult diagnoses with limited resources, and to see patients not as interesting cases, but as human beings whose lives hung in the balance. After completing her clinical rotations and graduating from Imperial College, Addaura had been recruited by several prestigious hospitals, but she had chosen to continue working in community medicine. She spent 3 years at a clinic in Manchester, treating everything from routine infections to complex trauma cases, building a reputation for exceptional diagnostic skills and an ability to connect with patients from all backgrounds. Her breakthrough had come during a meningitis outbreak in a primarily immigrant neighborhood. While other doctors had been slow to recognize the pattern, Addaura had identified the cluster of cases early and coordinated a response that saved dozens of lives. The case had attracted national attention and led to her recruitment by St. Bartholomew's, one of London's premier teaching hospitals. Now, 15 years after that humiliating night outside St. Mary's, Dr. Addaura Okafor was the head of emergency medicine at Bart's, overseeing a department that handled some of the most complex medical cases in the city. She had published research papers, spoken at international conferences, and trained a new generation of physicians who looked up to her as both a mentor and an inspiration. But success hadn't come without personal costs. The demands of her career had made maintaining relationships difficult, and she had never married or had children. Her parents had eventually come to London for her graduation ceremony, and she had been able to provide them with better medical care than they could have received in Nigeria. But she sometimes wondered if the sacrifices had been worth it. The radio crackled with an incoming ambulance report, pulling her back to the present moment. "Bart's, this is Ambulance 772. We have a 43-year-old male, myocardial infarction. Unresponsive. ETA 4 minutes. Addaura nodded to her team, the familiar adrenaline surge that came with emergency medicine sharpening her focus. "Trauma Bay 2, she called out. "Let's move." As she pulled on fresh gloves and checked that all the necessary equipment was ready, Addaura had no idea that the patient about to arrive would be someone from her past, someone whose casual cruelty had nearly derailed her dreams but had ultimately led her to become the exceptional physician she was today. The automatic doors burst open as the paramedics wheeled in the gurney, the patient pale and unconscious, connected to a web of monitoring equipment that painted an alarming picture of cardiac distress. It wasn't until they transferred him to the examination table and she got her first clear look at his face that recognition hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Whitfield, 15 years older, his hair now showing threads of silver and his face bearing the lines of stress and privilege, but unmistakably the same man who had watched her struggle outside St. Mary's Hospital and chosen to look away. For a moment, Addaura felt the world shift around her. The professional training that had carried her through thousands of medical emergencies, warred with a flood of memories and emotions she thought she had long since buried. The young woman who had pleaded for a chance, who had been dismissed and humiliated, seemed to stand beside her in the trauma bay, waiting to see what the successful physician would do. But Dr. Addaura Okafor had not become one of London's most respected emergency physicians by letting personal feelings interfere with patient care. Whatever history existed between them, whatever pain his rejection had caused, the man on the table was dying, and she was possibly the only person in the city with the skill to save him. "What do we have?" she asked the paramedic, her voice steady and professional as she began her assessment. "Massive probable LAD occlusion. He was down for approximately 3 minutes before we got him back. Vitals have been unstable throughout transport." Addaura's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse points, examining the EKG readout, assessing the damage. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The man who had once been too important to acknowledge her existence now depended entirely on her expertise for his survival. "Get cardiothoracic surgery on the line," she ordered, "and prep the cath lab. We're going to need to move fast if we want to save him." As her team sprang into action around her, Addaura found herself looking down at Marcus Whitfield's unconscious face, remembering the last time their eyes had met and wondering if he would remember her when he woke up. If he woke up, the next few hours would determine not just whether Marcus Whitfield lived or died, but whether Dr. Addaura Okafor was the kind of person who could rise above the past to do what was right, even for someone who had once failed. To do the same for her. The cardiac catheterization lab at St. Bartholomew's Hospital hummed with controlled urgency as Dr. Addaura Okafor scrubbed it in for what would prove to be the most emotionally challenging surgery of her career. Through the observation window, she could see Marcus Whitfield lying unconscious on the table, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads as machines monitored his failing heart. "Dr. Okafor?" The voice belonged to Dr. James Sullivan, the head of cardiothoracic surgery, who had rushed in from his own emergency case. "I can take over from here if you'd prefer. I know these high-profile cases can be complicated." Addaura paused, her hands suspended under the surgical scrub dispenser. Sullivan was offering her an out, a chance to step away from a situation that was already attracting attention throughout the hospital. Word had spread quickly that Marcus Whitfield, heir to one of Britain's largest pharmaceutical companies, was fighting for his life in their emergency department. "What makes you think this is complicated for me?" she asked, though she knew exactly what Sullivan meant. In the 15 years since she had become a doctor, Addaura had learned to recognize the subtle ways colleagues sometimes questioned her ability to handle certain cases, usually the ones involving wealthy, powerful white patients. Sullivan had the grace to look embarrassed. "I just meant, with the media attention this will attract, the family connections, the politics involved with someone of his stature." "Dr. Sullivan," Addaura interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "Marcus Whitfield has a massive myocardial infarction with complete LAD occlusion. His ejection fraction is down to 15%, and he's showing signs of cardiogenic shock. I don't care if he's the Prime Minister himself. Right now he's a patient who needs surgery, and I'm the one best qualified to perform it." The truth was more complicated than her confident words suggested. As she finished scrubbing and moved toward the operating theater, Addaura's mind was a battlefield between her professional ethics and 15 years of buried resentment. She had spent the better part of her career proving that she belonged in rooms like this, that her skills were equal to or better than those of her colleagues, that her presence wasn't a token gesture, but a testament to her abilities. Now, with Marcus Whitfield's life literally in her hands, she faced the ultimate test of who she had become versus who she had once been. The surgery itself was a masterpiece of precision and skill. Working with her usual team of nurses and technicians, Adaura navigated the complex landscape of Marcus's damaged cardiovascular system with the kind of intuitive understanding that separated good surgeons from great ones. The blocked artery that was killing him was located in one of the most difficult areas to access, requiring a delicate approach that few surgeons in London would have attempted. "Pressure's dropping," called out Maria Santos, the lead surgical nurse who had worked with Adaura for over 5 years. "BP is 80/40 and falling." Adaura's hands never wavered as she maneuvered the tiny balloon catheter through the maze of blood vessels toward the blockage. On the monitors around her, Marcus's vital signs painted a picture of a man whose body was shutting down, but she remained focused on the millimeter-by-millimeter progress of her instruments. "There," she said softly as the catheter reached the occlusion. Maria prepped the stent. What happened next required the kind of surgical artistry that couldn't be taught in medical school. The blockage was more severe than the initial scans had suggested, with calcification that made the standard approach impossible. For a moment, even Adaura hesitated, weighing the risks of an experimental technique she had pioneered, but used only twice before. "Dr. Okafor?" Dr. Chun, the anesthesiologist, was watching the monitors with growing concern. His heart rhythm is becoming increasingly unstable. "Whatever you're going to do, ... I know," Adaura replied, her decision made. She began the delicate process of threading a second, smaller catheter through a different approach, using a technique she had developed during her research fellowship but had never attempted on such a critically ill patient. As she worked, fragments of memory flashed through her mind. That night 15 years ago, standing outside St. Mary's Hospital in her worn jacket, pleading for a chance. The casual dismissal in Marcus's voice when he had sided with the other wealthy observers. The humiliation of being escorted away by security while he watched with cold indifference. But stronger than the memories of that night were the lessons that had followed. The years of struggle that had taught her resilience. The patients in Birmingham and Manchester who had trusted her with their lives. The moment she had first realized that she was becoming the kind of doctor who could save people others had given up on. "Stent is in position," she announced, and the room seemed to exhale collectively as Marcus's vital signs began to stabilize. The surgery took 4 hours. Far longer than anticipated due to the complexity of the blockage and the innovative approach required to clear it. When Adaura finally stepped back from the table, she was exhausted, but satisfied that she had done everything possible to save her patient's life. "Outstanding work, Dr. Okafor," Dr. Sullivan said as they moved Marcus to the cardiac intensive care unit. "I've never seen anyone navigate that kind of calcification with such precision." "The technique you used, where did you learn that?" "I developed it during my fellowship in Manchester," Adaura replied, watching as the ICU team took over Marcus's care. "Sometimes working with limited resources forces you to innovate." What she didn't say was that the technique had been born from necessity during her early years treating patients who couldn't afford the most advanced procedures. She had learned to find solutions that worked with whatever equipment was available, to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. As the adrenaline of surgery began to fade, Adaura found herself alone in the corridor outside the ICU, finally processing the emotional weight of what had just occurred. She had spent 4 hours fighting to save the life of a man who had once symbolized everything she was fighting against: privilege, indifference, the casual cruelty of those who had never known real struggle. "Dr. Okafor?" A young resident approached hesitantly. "There are some people here asking about Mr. Whitfield. They say they're from his company. And there are also some reporters outside... Adaura sighed. She had expected this, the media attention, the corporate representatives, the inevitable circus that surrounded wealthy patients. In a few hours, when Marcus woke up, she would have to face him directly for the first time since that night 15 years ago. The question was whether he would remember her, and if he did, how both of them would handle the implications of their shared history. "Tell them he's in stable condition, but critical," she instructed the resident. "No visitors except immediate family for the next 24 hours. And make sure security keeps the media out of the hospital." As she walked back toward her office, Adaura's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Nigeria, her father, calling at what would be early morning in Enugu. "Papa," she answered, stepping into a quiet alcove near the elevators. "Adaura, my daughter," her father's voice was weak but warm. "I hope I'm not disturbing you at work." "Never, Papa. How are you feeling? Did you see the doctor about your cough?" There was a pause, and when her father spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her heart clench. "That's why I'm calling. My dear, the doctor says there's something wrong with my lungs, something serious." Adaura felt the world tilt around her. After everything, the struggles, the success, the years of building a career that would allow her to help her family, her father was sick and she was thousands of miles away. "What did he say exactly?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain calm and professional. "Lung cancer, he thinks. But Adaura, the treatment, we cannot afford what he's recommending. Even with the money you send, it's too much." The irony hit her like a physical blow. She had just spent 4 hours saving the life of one of the wealthiest men in Britain, using techniques and equipment worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, while her own father, the man who had sacrificed everything to give her this opportunity, couldn't afford basic cancer treatment. "Papa, listen to me," she said firmly. "Don't worry about the money. I'll take care of everything. I'll arrange for you to come to London to get the best treatment available." "Adaura, we cannot ask you to." "You're not asking," she interrupted. "I'm telling you. You gave me everything so I could become a doctor. Now let me take care of you." After the call ended, Adaura stood in the empty corridor, overwhelmed by the convergence of past and present, professional duty and personal crisis. In one day, she had come face to face with the man who had nearly destroyed her dreams and learned that the father who had made those dreams possible was fighting for his own life. She thought about the young woman she had been 15 years ago, desperate and naive, believing that fairness and merit would be enough to overcome the barriers placed in her path. That woman would have been bitter about saving Marcus Whitfield's life, would have seen it as an cosmic injustice that she was required to help someone who had shown her no mercy. But Dr. Adaura Okafor was not that young woman anymore. She had learned that the highest form of victory wasn't revenge but transcendence, the ability to be better than those who had wronged you, to choose compassion even when it wasn't deserved. As she prepared to return to her duties, Adaura made a decision that would define not just her relationship with Marcus Whitfield, but her understanding of who she had become. Whatever happened when he woke up, whatever recognition or lack thereof passed between them, she would face it as the person her struggles had made her, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of grace than the man whose life she had just saved. The next 24 hours would test everything she believed about forgiveness, justice, and the true meaning of healing. But for now, Dr. Adaura Okafor had work to do, patients to see, and a father to save. The reckoning with Marcus Whitfield would have to wait. The first thing Marcus Whitfield became aware of was the steady beeping of monitors, a mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo the heavy thudding in his chest. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and when he finally managed to open them, the world appeared in fragments: white ceiling tiles, the soft glow of medical equipment, and the antiseptic smell that marked him unmistakably in a hospital. Pain radiated from his chest, but it was A different kind of pain than what he remembered from the heart attack. This was surgical pain, the aftermath of intervention rather than the crushing agony of his cardiovascular system failing. As consciousness gradually returned, so did the realization that he was alive, something that, based on his last clear memories, had been far from certain. "Mr. Whitfield?" A voice called softly from somewhere to his right. "Can you hear me?" Marcus turned his head slowly, fighting through the fog of medication and post-surgical confusion. A young nurse in blue scrubs stood beside his bed, checking the readings on one of the many machines connected to his body. "Where am I?" His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, his throat raw from the intubation. "You're in the cardiac intensive care unit at St. Bartholomew's Hospital," the nurse replied gently. "You've had surgery to repair damage from a heart attack. How are you feeling?" Heart attack. The words hit him with surprising force, despite his already suspecting the diagnosis. At 43, he had always assumed he had decades before such concerns became relevant. His grandfather had lived to 92, and despite the stress of recent years, Marcus had maintained excellent physical fitness. "How long have I been here?" he asked, trying to piece together the timeline of events. "About 18 hours since." "Your surgery," the nurse replied, making notes on his chart. "Your surgeon will want to see you now that you're awake. Let me page Dr. Okafor." Dr. Okafor. The name struck Marcus as vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Through the haze of medications and the disorientation of waking up in intensive care, he found himself trying to remember details about his medical team, about who had been responsible for saving his life. 10 minutes later, the door to his private room opened, and Marcus felt his world shift in a way that had nothing to do with his medical condition. The woman who walked in was tall, elegant, and unmistakably confident in the way she moved through the clinical environment. She wore the white coat of a senior physician, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to being in charge of complex situations, but it was her face that stopped his breath entirely. 15 years older, more sophisticated, with the kind of professional polish that came from success and respect, but unmistakably the same woman who had stood outside St. Mary's Hospital with a stack of papers and desperate hope in her eyes. Dr. Adaura Okafor stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing his chart with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. When she finally looked up and met his eyes, Marcus saw immediate recognition pass between them. A moment of electric acknowledgement that the past had suddenly, impossibly, collided with the present. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice professionally neutral, but carrying undertones that suggested she was working to maintain that neutrality. "I'm Dr. Okafor, head of emergency medicine here at Bart's. I was your surgeon yesterday." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing to process the implications of what she had just said. The woman he had dismissed so casually 15 years ago, whose struggle he had witnessed and chosen to ignore, had just saved his life. The irony was so profound it felt almost surreal. "Dr. Okafor," he repeated slowly, the name now carrying weight he hadn't expected. You performed my surgery?" "Yes," she replied simply, moving to check his monitors with professional detachment. "You suffered a massive myocardial infarction with complete occlusion of your left anterior descending artery. The blockage was severe and in a difficult location, but we were able to clear it and place a stent. Your prognosis is good, assuming you follow the prescribed recovery protocol." Her tone was clinical, informative, giving no indication that she remembered their previous encounter. But Marcus could see something in her eyes, not anger or satisfaction, but a kind of careful control that suggested she was very much aware of who he was and what had passed between them. "Do you ... he began, then stopped, unsure how to ask. The question that was burning in his mind, "Do I remember you?" Adaura completed his sentence, her voice remaining steady. Yes, Mr. Whitfield, I remember you quite well. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Marcus felt the weight of 15 years of consequences settling on his chest, heavier than the surgical dressings and monitor leads. Here, in his moment of ultimate vulnerability, face to face with someone whose life he had casually dismissed, he was confronted with the true measure of who he had been and who he had become. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. Adora paused in her examination of his chart. "Why what, Mr. Whitfield? Why did you save me?" The question came out more raw and honest than he had intended. "After what happened. After how I treated you ... Why didn't you just let someone else handle my case?" For the first time since entering the room, Adora's professional mask slipped slightly. She moved closer to his bed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of growth and hard-won wisdom. "Because, Mr. Whitfield, I didn't become a doctor to decide who deserves to live based on how they've treated me in the past. I became a doctor to heal people who need healing, regardless of whether they've earned that compassion." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. In her response, he heard not just professional ethics, but a moral clarity that highlighted the poverty of his own character during that night 15 years ago. "I don't deserve it," he said quietly. "No," Adora agreed, her honesty startling. "In its directness, you probably don't. But deserving has very little to do with medicine. You were dying, and I had the skills to save you. That's where my responsibility begins and ends." Marcus felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, something that would have been unthinkable in his previous life, where showing weakness was tantamount to admitting defeat. But lying in that hospital bed, faced with the woman whose dreams he had helped crush, he felt the full weight of his own moral failures. "I was wrong," he said, the admission coming from somewhere deep inside him that had been locked away for years. "What I did that night ... what I said ... it was wrong, and I'm sorry." Adora studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his contrition was genuine or simply the desperation of a man who owed his life to someone he had wronged. "Your apology is noted," she said finally. "But it doesn't change anything that's already happened. You made your choice that night based on who you were then. I made my choice yesterday based on who I am now." The distinction was devastating. In its clarity, Marcus realized that while he was seeking forgiveness for past actions, Adora had moved beyond needing to forgive him. She had transcended their shared history not by excusing his behavior, but by becoming someone for whom his approval or disapproval was simply irrelevant. "What happened to you?" he asked. "After that night, I mean. Did you ... were you able to continue your studies?" Adora's expression softened slightly, though whether from memory or pity, Marcus couldn't tell. "Eventually. It took longer than planned, and not in the way I had originally hoped. But I found another path." She didn't elaborate on the struggles, the near deportation, the months of uncertainty, or the years of working in understaffed clinics with limited resources. Marcus could see in her bearing that the path had been difficult, but also that it had forged her into someone exceptional. "I need to ask you some questions about your medical history," she continued, returning to professional territory. "Family history of heart disease, previous symptoms you might have ignored, lifestyle factors that could have contributed to this event." As they went through the clinical interview, Marcus found himself studying her with new eyes. The woman who had once stood outside a hospital begging for a chance had become someone who commanded respect simply by entering a room. Her questions were insightful, her manner confident but not arrogant, her competence evident in every aspect of her professional bearing. "Dr. Okafor," he said when she had finished her examination, "I need you to know that what happened that night ... it's haunted me. Not constantly, but there have been moments over the years when I've thought about it, about you, about the choice I made." Adora paused at the door, her hand on the handle. When she turned back to face him, her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to give you some advice, both as your doctor and as someone who has learned something about moving forward from difficult circumstances. Guilt is a useless emotion unless it motivates change. If you want to honor what happened between us, don't spend your energy feeling sorry about the past. Spend it becoming someone who would make a different choice if faced with the same situation today." With that, she left the room, leaving Marcus alone with the monitors and the weight of her words. He stared at the ceiling, processing not just the physical reality of his near-death experience, but the profound moral reckoning that had accompanied it. Outside his room, Adora leaned against the wall for a moment, allowing herself to feel the full emotional impact of the encounter she had just navigated. Seeing Marcus Whitfield humbled and vulnerable had been less satisfying than she might have expected 15 years ago. Instead, she felt a complex mixture of sadness for the wasted years he had spent as someone she couldn't respect, and hope that perhaps his brush with mortality might catalyze the kind of growth that genuine crisis sometimes makes possible. Her phone buzzed with a message from the travel agent she had contacted about bringing her father to London for treatment. The arrangements were complicated and expensive, but she had the resources now to provide him with the best care available. As she read the details, Adora reflected on the strange symmetry of the day, saving the life of a man who had once shown her no mercy, while preparing to fight for the life of the man who had shown her nothing but love. The next few days would determine not just Marcus Whitfield's physical recovery, but whether their encounter would mark the beginning of something resembling redemption or simply the closing of a circle that had never needed to be completed. For now, Dr. Adora Okafor had other patients to see, other lives to save, and a father to bring home. Marcus Whitfield's recovery progressed faster than anyone had anticipated, but the physical healing was only part of a much more complex transformation taking place. During his week-long stay in the cardiac ICU, he found himself in the unusual position of having nothing to do but think, something that his previous life of constant meetings, phone calls, and crisis management had rarely allowed. Corporate world had initially descended on the hospital like a swarm of locusts. Sarah Chun had arrived within hours of his surgery, followed by board members, legal advisors, and a parade of executives all eager to discuss the company's precarious position and the decisions that couldn't wait for his full recovery. But after 3 days of watching these visits exhaust him, Dr. Okafor had intervened with the kind of medical authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Whitfield is recovering from major cardiac surgery," she had informed the assembled corporate delegation. "Continued stress could trigger another cardiac event. All business discussions are postponed for at least 2 weeks, or until I clear him for that level of activity." The relief Marcus felt when his room finally fell quiet was profound. For the first time in years, he was truly alone with his thoughts, forced to confront not just his mortality, but the life he had been living and the man he had become. The long hours between medical checks and physical therapy sessions, Marcus found himself replaying not just that night 15 years ago, but the entire trajectory that had followed. He thought about his marriage to Catherine, a union based more on social expectations than genuine connection, which had ultimately collapsed under the weight of his emotional unavailability and obsessive focus on work. He thought about his relationships with his employees, his friends, even his family. How many of those connections were genuine, and how many were simply transactions based on what he could provide or what others could gain from associating with him? The question was uncomfortable because he suspected he already knew the answer. On his 4th day in the hospital, Marcus was strong enough to walk the corridors with assistance from the physical therapy team. During one of these sessions, he encountered Dr. Okafor in the hallway, speaking quietly with a younger doctor about a complex case. He watched her from a distance, noting the respect in her colleague's demeanor, the confidence with which she explained treatment options. the natural authority that marked her as someone others looked to for leadership. It was a stark contrast to the desperate, young woman he had dismissed 15 years earlier, and Marcus found himself wondering about the journey that had transformed her from someone pleading for opportunities into someone who created them for others. "Mr. Whitfield?" The physical therapist's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Marcus replied, but continued watching as Dr. Okafor finished her consultation and moved on to check on other patients. "The doctor who performed my surgery, Dr. Okafor, how long has she been at this hospital?" The therapist, a friendly woman named Janet who had been working with cardiac patients for over a decade, smiled. "Dr. Okafor? About 8 years now. She came here from Manchester, where she had built quite a reputation working in community medicine. She's incredible, one of those doctors who can diagnose things other people miss, and she genuinely cares about every patient, regardless of their background." "What do you mean, regardless of their background?" Janet glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then lowered her voice. "Well, this is London's medical community. There can be a lot of politics around certain types of patients. Wealthy donors get attention, the poor sometimes get overlooked, that sort of thing. But Dr. Okafor treats everyone exactly the same. She's just as thorough with someone who can't pay their bills as she is with ... She paused, realizing she might be speaking too candidly to a wealthy patient. "As she is with someone like me," Marcus finished quietly. "I didn't mean any offense," Janet said quickly, none taken. "I was just curious about her background." That evening, alone in his room as the hospital settled into its quieter nighttime rhythm, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Using his tablet, he began researching Dr. Adara Okafor's career, but not from his usual perspective as someone looking for leverage or advantage. Instead, he found himself genuinely wanting to understand the path that had brought her to where she was. The information he found painted a picture of exceptional achievement, built on relentless determination. After completing her medical degree at Imperial College, apparently despite significant bureaucratic obstacles that were only vaguely referenced in the official records, she had chosen to work in underserved communities, rather than pursuing the more prestigious and lucrative positions typically sought by top graduates. Her research publications were impressive, focusing on emergency medicine techniques for resource-limited settings and innovative approaches to treating complex conditions with minimal equipment. She had been invited to speak at international conferences, had trained physicians from developing countries, and had established a foundation that provided medical equipment to clinics in rural Africa. But it was a newspaper article from 5 years earlier that stopped Marcus cold. The headline read, "Local Doctor's Innovation Saves Lives During Hospital Strike." The piece described how Dr. Okafor had organized volunteer physicians to provide emergency care in community centers when a labor dispute had closed several Manchester hospitals. Working with minimal resources and makeshift equipment, her team had treated dozens of critical patients who might otherwise have died waiting for the strike to end. The article included a quote that struck Marcus with particular force. "Medicine is not about the building or the equipment," Dr. Okafor had said. "It's about the commitment to heal whoever needs healing, wherever they are, with whatever resources you have available." As he read those words, Marcus was transported back to that night 15 years ago, remembering the determination in her eyes as she had pleaded for a chance to prove herself. The woman who had spoken those words to the newspaper was the same person who had stood outside St. Mary's Hospital, refused to give up despite repeated rejections, and had somehow found a way to turn her struggles into the foundation for an extraordinary career. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Emeka Nwosu, now in his 70s but still sharp and energetic, arrived during Marcus's breakfast with a warm smile and the bearing of someone comfortable in medical settings. "Mr. "Whitfield," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Nwosu, a friend and former mentor of Dr. Okafor. She mentioned you were here, and I wanted to stop by to see how you were recovering." Marcus shook the older man's hand, immediately sensing both warmth and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of medical practice. "It's kind of you to visit. Are you on staff here?" "Retired, actually, but I still maintain connections. Adaura, Dr. Okafor, was one of my students years ago. Brilliant young woman, though her path to where she is now wasn't always smooth." There was something in Dr. Nwosu's tone that suggested he knew more about Marcus's history with Adaura than he was immediately letting on. Marcus found himself curious about this man who had clearly played an important role in her development. She mentioned that her training took longer than originally planned. Marcus said carefully. Dr. Nwosu settled into the visitor's chair, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, there were some obstacles, bureaucratic issues that seemed to target students from certain backgrounds. But Adaura had something special, not just intelligence, though she certainly had that, but a genuine understanding of what medicine could mean to people who had been overlooked by the system." "How so?" "She grew up in a village where the nearest hospital was hours away, where people died from treatable conditions simply because there was no one qualified to help them. That experience gave her a perspective that many of her classmates, who came from more privileged backgrounds, simply couldn't understand." Marcus felt the implicit criticism in those words, though Dr. Nwosu's tone remained gentle and conversational. When she was struggling with her placement issues here in London, Dr. Nwosu continued, "I connected her with a clinic in Birmingham that was serving immigrant communities. The pay was minimal, the conditions were challenging, but it turned out to be exactly what she needed. Working with patients who had no other options, learning to make diagnoses with limited resources. It made her a better doctor than any prestigious hospital rotation could have." "She saved my life," Marcus said simply. "Yes, she did. And knowing Adaura, she probably did it with the same level of care and attention she would give to anyone, regardless of their ability to pay or their social connections." There was a pause before Dr. Nwosu added, "That's not always how medicine works in this city, as I'm sure you're aware." The statement hung in the air between them, and Marcus realized that this conversation was about more than just checking on his recovery. Dr. Nwosu was assessing him, trying to determine what kind of man he was and whether he understood the significance of what Dr. Okafor had done for him. "Dr. Nwosu," Marcus said slowly, "I think you know that Dr. Okafor and I met once before, many years ago, under very different circumstances." The older man nodded. "She mentioned it. She also mentioned that you seem to have learned something from the experience." "I'm trying to," Marcus replied honestly. "I made a choice that night that I'm not proud of. I let social pressure and my own cowardice prevent me from doing what I knew was right. But I'm not sure knowing that is enough. I'm not sure how to make amends for something like that." Dr. Nwosu studied him for a long moment. "You?" "No, Mr. Whitfield. In my experience, the best amends are made not through grand gestures or financial donations, but through becoming the kind of person who wouldn't make the same mistake again. Adaura doesn't need your apology or your money, but the world could use more people who choose courage over convenience when someone needs help." After Dr. Nwosu left, Marcus found himself staring out the window at the London skyline, thinking about the life he had built and the man he had become. For 43 years, he had moved through the world believing that his wealth and position made him superior to people who had less. But lying in that hospital bed, saved by someone he had once dismissed, he was beginning to understand that true worth had nothing to do with inheritance or privilege, and everything to do with how you treated others when it mattered most. Question now was whether this revelation would prove to be a temporary crisis of conscience brought on by his brush with mortality, or the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how he chose to live the rest of his life. As his physical strength returned, Marcus found himself facing a choice that was far more important than any business decision he had ever made, the choice of who he wanted to be when he left this hospital and returned to the world beyond its walls. On Marcus Whitfield's final day at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, he sat in his private room watching the morning news coverage of his company's board meeting. The headlines were brutal. Whitfield Pharmaceuticals in talks with American buyers. British pharma giant facing hostile takeover. End of an era for family-owned medical empire. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he had been fighting for his life, the empire his grandfather had built was slowly being dismantled by the very people he had trusted to protect it. Sarah Chun had called the night before to brief him on the board's decision to accept Brennan Industries' latest offer, a sum that would make him personally wealthy beyond measure while effectively ending the Whitfield name in pharmaceutical history. The vote was unanimous, Sarah had explained, her voice tired and apologetic. Without you there to argue for alternatives, they felt they had no choice. The American executives are flying in tomorrow to finalize the details. Marcus had listened to the news with a strange sense of detachment. 3 weeks ago, the prospect of losing the company would have devastated him. Now sitting in a hospital room where he had learned more about the true meaning of success than in his entire previous life, the corporate machinations seemed almost irrelevant. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Adara Okafor entered with his discharge papers and the final medical instructions that would govern his recovery over the next several months. She looked tired. He had learned from the nursing staff that her father had arrived from Nigeria 2 days earlier and was undergoing aggressive cancer treatment in another wing of the hospital. Mr. Whitfield, she said, settling into the chair beside his bed with the easy familiarity of someone who had been managing his care for over a week. Your cardiac function has improved significantly. The stent is working well, and your latest blood work shows no signs of complications. She went through the discharge protocol with the same thorough professionalism she had shown throughout his stay. Medication schedules, follow-up appointments, activity restrictions, warning signs to watch for. But Marcus found himself only half listening to the medical details, instead studying her face for signs of the exhaustion he knew she must be feeling. Dr. Okafor, he interrupted gently, how is your father? The question caught her off guard. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and he saw the worry and fear she had been carrying alongside her medical responsibilities. It's complicated, she said finally. The cancer is more advanced than we initially thought, but he's responding well to treatment. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. I'm glad he's here where you can take care of him. Adara looked at him with something approaching surprise. Thank you. That means more than you might realize. They sat in silence for a moment, both aware that this would likely be their final conversation as doctor and patient. Marcus felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. 15 years of consequence and transformation that had led to this unlikely intersection of their lives. Dr. Okafor, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he needed to say. Mr. Whitfield, if this is another apology, I think we've covered that ground sufficiently. It's not an apology, he said quietly. It's a question. What you've built, your career, your reputation, the lives you've saved, did any of it come easier because of what happened that night? Did the struggle make you stronger, or would you have preferred a different path? Adara considered the question carefully before answering. You're asking if I'm grateful for being rejected and humiliated. I'm asking if you think there's any cosmic justice in how things turned out. You became extraordinary while I built nothing of real value despite having every advantage. Mr. Whitfield, the idea that suffering automatically makes people better is a comfortable fiction that people with privilege tell themselves to justify ignoring others' pain. I didn't become a good doctor because of what you did to me that night. I became a good doctor despite it, and despite 100 Other obstacles that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Her words were direct but not unkind, and Marcus felt their truth settle over him like a weight he had been avoiding for years. But, she continued, I will say this. The difficult path taught me things about resilience and empathy that the easy path never could have. When you've had to fight for every opportunity, you understand what those opportunities really cost. When you've been dismissed and overlooked, you're less likely to dismiss others. And when you've had everything handed to you, Marcus said quietly, you're more likely to take it for granted and treat others as if their struggles don't matter. Yes, Adaura agreed simply. Marcus reached for the bedside table and pulled out a manila folder he had been working on since Dr. Nwosu's visit. I've been thinking about what you said, about becoming someone who would make different choices. I wanted to show you something before I leave. He handed her the folder, which contained papers he had spent the past 3 days preparing with the help of his lawyers and financial advisors. Adaura opened it cautiously, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise as she read. This is a proposal for a medical foundation, she said, looking up at him with confusion. The Okafor Foundation for Emergency Medicine in Underserved Communities, Marcus confirmed. £50 million in initial funding, with a mandate to provide equipment, training, and support to clinics that serve patients who can't afford private care. I want you to run it. Adaura stared at the documents. Then at him, her expression unreadable. Mr. Whitfield, I don't want your money. I know. That's exactly why you're the right person to oversee how it's used. This feels like charity. Like you're trying to buy forgiveness or ease your conscience. Marcus had expected this reaction, and had spent considerable time thinking about how to explain his motivation in a way that would be honest rather than self-serving. Dr. Okafor, in 3 hours, I'm going to walk out of this hospital and into a world where I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, thanks to selling my family's company to people who care more about profit than patients. I can use that money to buy bigger houses, faster cars, and more meaningless luxuries. Or I can try to do something that honors what I learned from almost dying and being saved by someone I didn't deserve to have saved me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. This isn't about forgiveness or redemption. This is about the fact that there are brilliant young people out there right now who are facing the same obstacles you faced 15 years ago. And maybe if someone had done something like this back then, you wouldn't have had to struggle so hard to become who you are. Adaura continued reading through the foundation documents, her medical mind automatically assessing the scope and potential impact of what he was proposing. The funding would be substantial enough to make a real difference, and the structure he had outlined would ensure that resources went directly to patient care rather than administrative overhead. Why name it after me? She asked finally. Because you're the one who showed me what real medicine looks like. What it means to heal people, regardless of whether they can pay you back or offer you anything in return. Your name on this foundation means it will attract the right kind of people, doctors who care more about patients than prestige. Adaura closed the folder and looked at him for a long moment. You realize this doesn't change anything between us, don't you? This doesn't erase what happened or make us friends or give you some kind of moral absolution. I know, Marcus said sincerely. I'm not doing this to change the past or to make you think better of me. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and for the first time in my life, that seems to matter more than what people think of me for doing it. For the first time since he had woken up to find her standing over his hospital bed, Adaura smiled, not the professional courtesy she had maintained throughout his care, but something genuine and warm. You know, she said, when I stood outside St. Mary's Hospital 15 years ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen was being rejected and humiliated. But maybe the worst thing would have been if someone had helped me for the wrong reasons, to feel good about themselves, or to maintain their image as a generous person. At least what happened that night was honest about who you were. And this? Marcus asked, gesturing toward the foundation documents. This feels honest about who you're trying to become. Adaura stood up, gathering her medical charts and the foundation. Proposal. I'll consider your offer, Mr. Whitfield, but I have some conditions. First, you have no involvement in day-to-day operations. Second, all funding decisions go through a board of practicing physicians who work in community medicine. Third, we start small and prove the concept works before expanding. Agreed, Marcus said immediately. And fourth, she continued, you. Get back to your life and stop trying to manage mine. I was fine before you almost died, and I'll be fine after you recover. The best thing you can do to honor what happened here is to become someone who helps the next person who needs it without needing to be thanked or recognized for it. As she reached the door, Marcus called after her, Dr. Okafor? Thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what it looks like to live one that matters. She paused without turning around. Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitfield. And remember, being a good person isn't a one-time decision. It's a choice you have to make every day. After she left, Marcus finished packing his few belongings and prepared to return to a world that would look exactly the same, but feel completely different. Through his window, he could see the London skyline that had once represented his kingdom, and beyond it, a city full of people whose lives he had never considered, but whose struggles now seemed as real and important as his own. In a few hours, he would leave St. Bartholomew's Hospital as a different man than the one who had arrived unconscious and dying a week earlier. The question that remained was whether this transformation would prove lasting or whether the comfortable patterns of his old life would gradually erode the insights he had gained lying in a hospital bed, dependent on the skill and compassion of someone he had once failed to recognize as fully human. But for now, Marcus Whitfield was simply grateful to be alive, and for the first time in his 43 years, grateful to have learned what it truly meant to be saved. 2 years after, Marcus Whitfield walked out of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the small community clinic in East London, buzzed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine when it first opened its doors. The Okafor Foundation's first pilot location had become a model for how modern medicine could serve communities that traditional healthcare systems had left behind. Dr. Adaura Okafor moved through the clinic's bright, well-equipped examination rooms with the same purposeful efficiency she had always possessed, but there was something different in her bearing now, a sense of completion that came from seeing a vision fully realized. The foundation had exceeded even her ambitious expectations, establishing 12 clinics across Britain and training over 200 physicians in emergency care techniques specifically designed for resource-limited settings. Dr. Okafor called Amara, a young medical resident from Somalia who was completing her rotation at the clinic. The cardiac patient in room 3 is asking for you specifically. She says you saved her brother's life last year. Adaura smiled, remembering the case. A construction worker who had suffered a heart attack while working on a site where no ambulance could reach him quickly. Her team had performed an emergency procedure in the back of a delivery van, using techniques she had developed during her early years working with minimal equipment. As she entered room 3, she was greeted by an elderly woman whose face lit up with recognition and gratitude. Doctor, my brother Ibrahim. He's back at work now, healthy and strong. He wanted me to give you this. The woman handed Adaura a small hand-carved wooden figure, a traditional healing symbol from their homeland. It was the kind of gift that meant more than any amount of money could express, a reminder of why she had chosen medicine in the first place. After finishing her examination, Adaura stepped outside the clinic for a moment of quiet reflection. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since the foundation's arrival. Other community organizations had followed their lead, and what had once been a neglected area was now vibrant with small businesses, after-school programs, and the kind of social infrastructure that made communities thrive. Her phone rang with a call from her father in Nigeria. The cancer treatment in London had been successful, and he had returned home with a clean bill of health and stories that had made him something of a local celebrity. "Adaora, my daughter," his voice was strong and cheerful. "I have news from the village. The new clinic you helped establish has delivered its first baby, a little girl whose mother walked 3 hours to get there instead of 3 hours to the old hospital." The satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. With funding from the Okafor Foundation, they had established a satellite clinic in her home village, staffed by nurses and equipped with telemedicine technology that allowed consultation with specialists. In Lagos and London, it was exactly the kind of practical innovation that her childhood experiences had taught her the world needed. "That's wonderful, Papa. How is Dr. Amika settling in?" She had convinced her former mentor to oversee the African expansion of the foundation, and he had embraced the challenge with the enthusiasm of someone half his age. He says it reminds him of why he became a doctor in the first place. Yesterday he treated a farmer who had been hiding an infected wound for weeks because he couldn't afford to miss work. Simple antibiotics, but it saved his leg. After the call ended, Adaora found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Marcus Whitfield hadn't rejected her 15 years ago, would she have developed the resilience and perspective that now defined her approach to medicine? If he hadn't nearly died in her emergency room, would the foundation exist at all? The questions were impossible to answer, but they reminded her of something Dr. Nwosu had told her during her medical training. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Across London, in a modest office above a community legal aid center in Southwark, Marcus Whitfield finished reviewing grant applications for the foundation's expansion into mental health services. The space was a far cry from the glass towers where he had once conducted business, but it was exactly where he wanted to be. The sale of Whitfield Pharmaceuticals had indeed made him wealthy beyond any reasonable need, but the money had become a tool rather than a goal. He had kept enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly, and the rest had gone into the foundation and other charitable initiatives that he researched and funded quietly, without seeking recognition or publicity. His daily routine would have been unrecognizable to the man he had been 3 years earlier. He took public transport to work, ate lunch at the same community cafe every day, and spent his evenings volunteering at a literacy program for adults who had never learned to read. The lifestyle wasn't a performance or an attempt to prove anything. To anyone, it simply felt more authentic than anything he had ever done before. Marcus called Jenny Walsh, the foundation's operations director, from the next office. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's personal." Marcus looked up from his paperwork to see a young woman standing in the doorway, early 20s, professionally dressed, with an air of nervous determination that reminded him immediately of someone else he had once known. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Fatima Hassan. I'm a medical student at Imperial College, and I wanted to thank you for the scholarship program." Marcus gestured for her to sit down, recognizing her name from the foundation's files. She was one of 50 students from disadvantaged backgrounds who were receiving full funding for their medical education, along with mentorship and guaranteed clinical placements. "How are your studies going?" he asked, wonderfully. "I'm in my final year now, and I've been accepted for a residency at the Royal London Hospital. But Mr. Whitfield, I wanted to ask you something." She paused, gathering her courage. "Why did you start this program? I mean, really, why?" Marcus smiled at her directness. "What do you think the reason is? I think someone like me needed help once and maybe didn't get it when they should have. And you decided to make sure that didn't happen to other people." Her insight was remarkably accurate, and Marcus found himself impressed by her perceptiveness. "Something like that, yes. Well, I want you to know that it matters. Not just the money, though that's been life-changing. But knowing that someone believes in students like us, that someone thinks we belong in these institutions, that changes how you see yourself. After Fatima left, Marcus returned to his work with a sense of quiet satisfaction that had replaced the adrenaline-fueled highs of his corporate days. The foundation had become self-sustaining, with Dr. Okafor's leadership ensuring that every pound was used effectively. She had been true to her word about maintaining their professional distance. They had spoken only twice since his discharge. From the hospital, both times about foundation business, but he followed the foundation's work closely, reading every report and celebrating every success as if it were his own. The 12 clinics were treating thousands of patients who might otherwise have gone without care. The scholarship program had funded over 300 medical students from backgrounds similar to Dr. Okafor's own. The research initiatives were developing new approaches to emergency medicine that were being adopted internationally. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his cardiologist, reminding him about his annual follow-up appointment. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would be returning to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where this transformation had begun. His heart had healed completely, but the real healing had been deeper and more fundamental than any medical intervention could address. That evening, as he walked home through the streets of London, Marcus reflected on the conversation with Fatima and what it revealed about the ripple effects of choosing compassion over convenience. Every student the foundation supported would go on to treat patients who might otherwise be overlooked. Every clinic they established would serve families who had nowhere else to turn. Every innovation they funded would eventually help people whose names he would never know. It was the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly profits, but it felt more valuable than anything he had accomplished in his previous life. More importantly, it felt true to the person he had discovered himself capable of becoming when everything else was stripped away. The journey from that night 15 years ago, when he had chosen cowardice over courage, to this moment when helping others had become his primary purpose, hadn't been direct or easy, but it had been necessary. And as Marcus reached his small flat in a converted Victorian house, sharing space with a teacher, a social worker, and an artist, he realized that the man who had once owned penthouses and yachts had never been as rich as the man who now measured his wealth by the lives he could help change. The story that had begun with rejection and cruelty had evolved into something none of the participants could have predicted, a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of second chances, and the truth that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in spite of our worst moments, but because of what they teach us about who we really want to be. In a world where power often corrupts and privilege frequently breeds indifference, Marcus Whitfield and Dr. Okafor had discovered that the highest achievement isn't rising above others, but lifting others up. And in that discovery, both had found something more valuable than wealth or status. They had found purpose, meaning, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using whatever gifts you have in service of something larger than yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.